Tonight at 10, last-minute campaigning on the eve of Super Thursday, when millions of people go to the polls in Great Britain. Up to 40 million people can vote in Scotland, Wales and England, and there's a lot at stake.
There's a long list of different contests, the first real test of public opinion since the general election, and voters will have a chance to choose in nearly every corner of the UK.
If the SNP win an outright majority here in Scotland, will that take us one step closer to another referendum on Scottish independence?
After 22 years in power in Wales, will Labour win enough seats in the Senedd to stay in government?
Also on the programme tonight. A post-Brexit fishing row with France escalates. 2 Royal Navy patrol boats are being sent to Jersey to monitor the situation. Stepping up protection, some 18-year-olds in Wales get their first jab as plans are outlined for booster vaccines this autumn. Freely available, most 16 and 17-year-olds have seen porn recently, mostly online, says new research, now a legal challenge to tighten up the law.
And coming up in the sport on the BBC News Channel, Chelsea's men may be on the Champions League stage, but the women's team are on the verge of retaining the WSL title.
Good evening. Up to 40 million people in Great Britain go to the polls tomorrow on what's being called Super Thursday, the biggest local and devolved elections in years. Political parties have spent the day making last-ditch efforts to win votes for the Scottish and Welsh parliaments. In England, ballots will be cast for mayors in 13 of the biggest city areas, in some council elections and for the London Assembly. There are also 39 police and crime commissioners up for election in England and Wales. And there's a by-election in Hartlepool, which could tell us how Labour is doing in what was once its heartland. The only place in the UK without any elections tomorrow is Northern Ireland. Our political editor, Laura Kuhnsberg, reports.
Watch the stunts. You might think it's a general election. It's not quite yet, but tomorrow there is a huge sweep of ballots.
One more. Come on, we can do it.
And everyone in Great Britain has the first chance to have a say since his victory in 2019.
It's kind of birdie dance type thing.
Oh dear.
Here we go. It's a very important set of elections, and the choice, I think, is clear between the Labour opposition, who seem absolutely determined to continue to play political games, and government that is getting on with our agenda, getting on with people's priorities.
Jam, rice pudding, tomatoes.
But it's the first time too that Keir Starmer faces the electorate as the Labour leader.
I've got 5 + 1, is that?
18 months since his party took a thumping. Pressure on him to show it can get back on voters' lists.
Fantastic, ready to roll. We're going into the elections tomorrow, fighting for every vote. We've got excellent candidates, and what we need across the country are Labour candidates from their communities, that are going to stand up against this government, and that's the choice before the country tomorrow.
Decisions have been on hold in some parts of the country, one of so many delays during the coronavirus emergency that emptied our streets. So now there's a whopping 4,000 council seats up for grabs, a vital election for an MP in Hartlepool, city mayors and elections in Scotland and Wales too. But normal glad handing and door knocking has been restricted this time. Less face-to-face than mask-to-mask.
We have had a weird election campaign because of the pandemic, and we've not been able to get on the doors as much as we would have liked to. But when we have managed to talk to people, they're responding positively to the Liberal Democrat message, because we are community politicians. People know that if they get a Liberal Democrat councillor, things get done.
The cost of temporary accommodation in Lambeth, it runs into the millions.
And with multiple contests in different corners of the country, there are multiple parties fighting.
This growing recognition of the importance of the climate and ecological emergency, recognising that we are going to face a very uncertain and dangerous future if we don't do something right now. And that change needs to happen now, and it means that you need to vote Green to get Green.
This is a strange set of elections, not just because of the pandemic, but because of the scale. Millions upon millions of votes will be cast tomorrow, and they'll all matter. Even the tiniest parish council has an impact on how we live our lives. But there are contests from the smallest to the most significant of levels. National elections in Wales, and particularly in Scotland, that could trigger arguments about the future of the Union, the future of the United Kingdom itself. And the moment when the power, the decisions, transfer to you is nearly here. Laura Kunsberg, BBC News.
So the choices made by Scottish voters tomorrow could be felt far beyond Scotland if a pro-independence majority is returned to Holyrood. That could raise questions over whether there should be another referendum on leaving the UK. Our Scotland editor, Sarah Smith, reports.
Both votes for Labour tomorrow in the election.
In this unusual, socially distanced election, it's not the pandemic that dominates the debate, but instead it's the question of Scottish independence. That's tricky for Scottish Labour, who know they need to rebuild a lot of support before they can really challenge the SNP.
If you want to help build a credible alternative to Nicola Sturgeon and the SNP, you need to support me in this election campaign. Help me do it.
But you don't expect to win this election campaign. You don't expect to be First Minister yourself next week.
Well, I am many things. I doubt I'm Superman. So given where we were 10 weeks ago in the polls, and given where we need to get to, I don't think it was possible, but that's up to the people of Scotland to decide.
Stirling Castle gives a historic backdrop to what's being described as the most important Scottish election since the devolved Parliament was set up. And that's because if the SNP win an overall majority, they will claim that's an electoral mandate for having another referendum on Scottish independence. The Tories want to do what it says on the posters. They claim they're the only party that can stop an independence referendum.
What we can't have is an SNP majority government who go ahead unchecked. We need a check in Holyrood to stop them forging ahead with their plans to divide our country all over again.
So even if you don't win, you think you can block them from having another vote?
Vote Scottish Conservatives to stop that SNP majority, to stop a second independence referendum, and crucially, to allow us to focus on our recovery.
The Scottish Lib Dem leader will do almost anything to get his party noticed, and he's equally determined to try and stop another independence referendum.
Vote for Liberal Democrats in every corner of Scotland, because that will make sure the next Parliament is focused on recovery, not on independence.
The Scottish Greens are obviously focused on the climate emergency, but believe that could be better tackled in an independent Scotland.
We would like to have a referendum to go back and ask the people of Scotland that democratic question: who would you like making your decisions? Brexiteer Tories in Westminster, or a government in Scotland that we've actually voted for?
The SNP have taken their quest for another referendum right across the country. But no matter how many voters back Nicola Sturgeon here, the Prime Minister says he'll veto a vote on independence.
The Prime Minister is not immune or exempt from democracy. I know he thinks he is, but he's not. The question of Scotland's future shouldn't be determined by me or by Boris Johnson. It should be decided by the people of Scotland. And if people vote for that to be the case, then Boris Johnson has got no more right than any other politician to stand in the way of democracy.
Once the votes have been counted, the Holyrood Parliament could then become the epicentre of an unprecedented constitutional battle over the future of the United Kingdom. Of course, we can't take the result of any election for granted, but not one of the opposition parties in Scotland believe that they can beat the SNP to become the largest party in Holyrood. So the big question is whether the SNP can get 65 or more seats to secure that overall majority. If they do, they'll say that that is a mandate to have another independence referendum. If the Prime Minister will not agree, the matter could go to court. We could be looking at a legal battle over whether Holyrood has the right to legislate for another independence referendum, even if they don't have the backing of Westminster.
Sarah Smith, thank you. In Wales, after 22 years in government, Labour is hoping to hold on to its position as the largest party. All 60 seats in the Welsh Parliament are being contested. For the first time, 16 and 17-year-olds will be able to vote, while our Wales correspondent Hal Griffith is at the Senedd for us tonight. Hal.
Sophie, as you say, Labour has been in power here for over 2 decades, but it's the last 12 months or so that's been the focus of their campaign. In particular, First Minister Mark Drakeford's role in leading Wales through a pandemic. As unlikely as it seems, the trust and recognition that's won him has made him a bit of a political rock star over the last few months. People wanting autographs as he's out campaigning. Does that, however, translate into keeping all of Labour's seats? Well, the Welsh Tories will hope whatnot. They want people to think back before the pandemic, and in particular to the last general election 2019, when some red wall seats in North Wales turned blue. In South and West Wales, Plaid Cymru will be pushing Labour hard. They will want to see the pandemic as a potential precursor to eventual independence, with Wales making its own political decisions. As for the Lib Dems, tomorrow is really a story of survival. Can they hold on to the one and only Senate seat they have? This stage hasn't really delivered much political drama over the last 2 decades. In fact, only 12 constituency seats have ever changed hands since 1999. But this time around, there are lots of marginals, and that's where turnout could be key. Turnout in these elections in Wales has never even reached 50%. But with coronavirus concerns and some pretty unpredictable weather at the moment, well, who knows where the pieces will fall. The vote is tomorrow, but the counting in Wales doesn't start till Friday.
Thank you. So up to 40 million adults will be able to vote in Great Britain tomorrow. Rita Chakrabarti looks at what's at stake.
There's a bumper crop of elections this year. A full 7 contests are underway, and this is because there were elections that have been delayed from last year that are taking place now. Crucial amongst these are elections to the Scottish Parliament. This is the map as it was after the last elections to the Parliament. As you can see, whole swathes of yellow there. Those are the SNP seats. They got 63 last time. They're aiming for 65 or more for a majority, which would then allow them, should they be able to aim for a second independence referendum. Let's take a look at some of the seats that we'll be looking at that are fought over in the Scottish Parliament. Here's a selection, and you can see from the colours at the end that they're held at the moment by Labour, Tory, Lib Dem and SNP, so all the main parties in play here. As well as the constituencies in Scotland, voters also vote for a second regional list. It's a form of proportional representation whereby they return members of the Scottish Parliament for a wider region. There's a similar system that is in place in Wales. Let's take a look at Wales, where voters are voting for members of the Welsh Parliament, the Senedd. There are 60 seats up for grabs here. You can see how the map looked after the last election. Down the spine of the country is the green, that's Plaid Cymru. Labour is strong in the south and also up there in the northeast, and the Conservatives are strong in the west of the country and also by the English borders. Let's have a look similarly at some of the constituencies that we'll be watching very carefully. Llanelli, Delyn, very finely balanced margins there, so they should be very exciting contests. I want to also show you the local elections which are taking place in England, and there are 5,000 seats that are up for grabs here. You can see here the district councils as they were last time round, and 5,000 seats, that's about twice as many as you would have normally, and again that is because of the delay due to COVID. Let's go back to the list and remind ourselves that there are also elections to the London Assembly, there are mayoral elections, police and crime commissioners, and also a by-election for Westminster in Hartlepool. We should be getting results from Friday onwards, but they will be slower than usual because counting is slower because of COVID. So those results will come in from Friday and over the weekend.
Rita Chakrabarti there. Now let's return to our political editor, Laura Koonsberg, and a huge set of elections, a lot up for grabs.
That's right, Sophie. I mean, there's a good reason why political nerds have called this Super Thursday. There is so much going on, a whole encyclopedia of different contests from big to small. And that's why I think we'll have to be careful in the next few days about drawing out any one particular picture. That said, there are 3 pressing political questions that the tons of evidence these votes will put forward will help to answer on the national stage. First of all, can Boris Johnson really show that he's cementing that trend from the general election when areas that had been closely held by Labour for a long time started in big number to turn blue? For Keir Starmer, it's his first time at the national ballot box as Labour's leader. What evidence can he show the public and his party that he's really got a chance of turning things round after that same general election meant such disaster for that party? But the third question, which is perhaps the most acute of all is how far along the road does the SNP's result get them in that call for pushing for another referendum on Scottish independence that could lead to months, maybe years of battles in the court, battles in various parliaments over the constitution and the future of the whole of the United Kingdom. There is so much to vote on, and there'll be so much to discuss in the days ahead. The polls open in less than 9 hours' time, but the results won't be known in full for a few days.
Laura Kunsberg, thank you. The rest of the news now, and 2 Royal Navy patrol vessels are being sent to Jersey to monitor the situation after a row erupted with France over post-Brexit fishing rights. The French government threatened to cut off power supplies to Jersey in a dispute over a new licensing system for French fishing vessels. Robert Hall is in Jersey for us tonight. And the latest, Robert?
Well, news that those vessels were being deployed came following a phone call to the Jersey government from Number 10, from Boris Johnson, who expressed his unwavering support for Jersey's position. To be fair, Jersey's politicians have been trying very hard for the past few days to calm things down ahead of a protest, of which more in a moment. So how did we get here? Well, Channel Island fishermen and French fishermen traditionally have worked together pretty well most of the time, but that started to go downhill after Brexit, when Jersey started to re-establish its territorial waters. And at the weekend, it also began to issue licences to French boats. Those licences cover boats that are regularly here, cover what they can catch, covers the amount of time that they're in Jersey waters. And there was almost immediate pushback from the French communities like Granville and Carteret along the Normandy coast, who said, look, this is untenable, we haven't had enough time, there's detail here which is just unacceptable and unworkable. And at a meeting in Cherbourg a couple of days ago, they got together with other fishing ports and said, look, we are going to have to do something here. We are going to stop Jersey boats landing. We are going to go and protest in Jersey. That looks like going ahead. And then we had that speech in the French Parliament yesterday from the Maritime Minister saying, look, we may use Jersey's supply from our grid as a negotiating tool. As I speak, around 70 boats are said to be on their way to Jersey. They're going to anchor outside St Helier. They may well be protesting or blockading. Whether the presence of the Royal Navy will help or hinder, we shall see in the coming days.
Robert Hall, thank you. For the first time since September, the UK has recorded its lowest weekly number of deaths with coronavirus. That's according to the latest figures published by the Office for National Statistics. But ministers say they are already looking ahead to the autumn, when the NHS will be ready to give booster jabs to those over the age of 50. And in some parts of Wales, as our health editor Hugh Pym reports, people over 18 are already being offered a jab.
Waiting for vaccinations in North Wales today. In some areas like this, those as young as 18 are being invited for a first dose. People under 30 in priority groups like health and care workers have already been offered a jab. Now some Welsh health boards, in line with expert guidance, are giving the Pfizer vaccine to others in that age range.
Got a letter one day and just went here. Yeah, because I got my letter. My twin sister hasn't had hers.
Got a letter through the post, and then got a text message, and then just came here. Very quick, very good, to be fair.
Really surprised, but really happy. Finally get it done and start getting back to normal.
Latest figures for all those aged 18 and over show in Wales 74% have had a first jab. In England it's 66% of adults, in Northern Ireland 65% have had a first dose, and in Scotland 64% of 18-year-olds and over. As the drive to offer all adults a first dose continues, ministers are already planning an autumn booster campaign. A range of options are being looked at, including tweaking jabs to protect against variants,
Feel it now. There you go, you're over the word.
And mixing vaccines with a third dose different from the first two.
The NHS team is already planning to be ready for deployment from September onwards, but the decision hasn't been made as to whether we go September or later in the year or early next year. That depends on the clinicians.
Testing existing and new vaccines against variants will be stepped up at Porton Down, run by Public Health England. Nearly £30 million will be invested by the government to increase capacity to analyse blood samples. These will show levels of antibodies generated by vaccines. Officials say for now they're watching closely the spread in the UK of Indian variants of the virus.
At the moment, we have not declared those variants of concern, and that is because we don't have any evidence so far that they are either more severe in terms of clinical presentation or, for example, that they have an adverse impact on the vaccine. But our investigations are ongoing and they are not completed yet.
Aid flights to India are continuing. British Airways is flying 27 tons of medical items, including oxygen cylinders, to Delhi. A reminder that however positive the news here, the virus is taking a deadly toll in some other countries. Hugh Pym, BBC News.
Well, the latest figures show there were 2,144 new infections in the latest 24-hour period, meaning an average of 2,020 new cases per day in the last week. 27 deaths were reported in the latest 24-hour period. That's people who died within 28 days of a positive test. On average, in the past week, 13 deaths were announced every day. The total number of deaths is now 127,570. As for vaccinations, almost 35 million people have now had their first dose of a COVID vaccine, and nearly 16 million people are now fully vaccinated. The entire Indian delegation to the G7 summit of leading economies in London is now self-isolating after 2 members tested positive for COVID. The news came as foreign ministers reconvened for the last day of the talks, which had been hailed as a return to face-to-face diplomacy. Our diplomatic correspondent James Landale reports.
Boris Johnson dropping by the G7 talks this afternoon, determined to show confidence in an international meeting hit by a COVID scare, determined to show that face-to-face diplomacy is possible in a pandemic.
I had a very good meeting with Secretary Blinken.
India's foreign minister, a guest at the talks, has spent the last few days in London meeting counterparts from the United States and South Africa, even the Home Secretary, Priti Patel. But then this morning, this. In a tweet, he said that he was made aware yesterday evening of his exposure to possible COVID-positive cases. As a measure of abundant caution, I decided to conduct my engagements in the virtual mode. India has suffered grievously in recent weeks, and it appears 2 junior officials may have travelled while infected. The Foreign Office has imposed tight COVID rules at Lancaster House, and the Indian delegation had yet to attend any meetings here. But the cases were picked up by mandatory daily tests. The Foreign Secretary said the problem had been managed and it was vital for essential diplomacy to continue.
We've done this in a very secure way, but we've got to get governments together, leaders together, countries together, if we're going to solve what is clearly not just a global pandemic, but a global plan for recovery.
So today, the Indian minister joined the meeting in the now traditional way. Officials say the discovery of these 2 cases show the effectiveness of the tight regulations they put in place. But it will surely raise questions about whether it's too early for face-to-face diplomacy like this, and whether future planned international meetings should go ahead in person as planned. As it happened, the pandemic was top of today's agenda. The ministers agreed to produce more vaccines, share them more fairly, but there was no promise to spend more money doing so. James Landale, BBC News.
Most 16 and 17-year-olds in the UK have seen pornography recently, much of it online, according to new research. There is currently no requirement for those viewing content to prove their age. The government says it's planning new laws to address the issue, but now a father and a student campaigner are launching a legal challenge to get ministers to bring in an existing law on age verification in the meantime. Our education editor Bramwyn Jeffries reports.
It's not hard for children to stumble across pornography on social media, on free-to-view websites, a danger the government plans to tackle. But now a dad of 4 sons and a student campaigner are taking legal action. They want more immediate protection for children. For Yanis, there was a turning point when one of his sons was found searching for porn.
In the two weeks leading up to this moment, we'd noticed a drastic change in his behaviour. There was withdrawal, there was suddenly this sense of anger towards siblings.
What are the pressures that you think led to your son feeling that he needed to explore this?
he sometimes gets exposed to conversation in the cafeteria lines. There are terms mentioned that he was unfamiliar with, and I think it was a sense of inquisitive exploration, not wanting to feel left out.
Ava is a student campaigner. She's written about a culture of sexual violence in schools. She's worried any new law could take several years.
Porn is everywhere, and growing up as a young woman, I've seen the influence of that. I think young men are ingesting pornography online to an extent that people aren't aware of.
A law requiring proof of age on pornography sites exists, but hasn't been used. Instead, ministers plan a new, wider law. Today, new research shows exposure to porn is widespread, most often on social media platforms.
Well, I think the UK government is right to bring social media platforms into scope when it's trying to regulate online pornography, because we do see that actually social media platforms are the most common way for 16 and 17-year-olds to have come across pornography.
Campaigners want the existing law used in the meantime. So we know that teenagers are coming across porn on social media, searching for it or even visiting porn websites. And whatever the controls in place at home, they have in their hands a powerful tool for browsing and sharing. And there's growing evidence that viewing violent or extreme porn alters attitudes to women, but can also distort their own expectations of their first relationships.
Well, there's a wealth of evidence that shows that viewing pornography leads to harmful sexual attitudes and behaviours. The government's own research, which it published this year, shows an association between porn consumption and real-world violence against women.
A new draft law could come to Parliament within a year. The government says it's committed to protecting children. Bronwyn Jeffries, BBC News. The probation officer who was in charge of the man who carried out the fatal attacks at Fishmongers Hall in London has told an inquest that he had no indication he was being deceived by Usman Khan, but he admitted that there had been some prison intelligence that Khan might return to his old ways despite the prisoner education scheme. Daniel Sanford reports.
The disastrous consequences of allowing a recently released high-risk convicted terrorist travel alone to London. The battle on London Bridge with Usman Khan, who just stabbed 2 people to death. Saskia Jones and Jack Merritt had been involved with Learning Together, a prison education organisation whose event Khan had been attending. Khan had been a difficult prisoner, involved in violence against other inmates and radicalisation. He'd improved his behaviour, but there was intelligence suggesting that he might go back to his old ways. The inquests into the deaths of Saskia Jones and Jack Merritt have heard that it was Usman Khan's probation officer, Ken Skelton, who authorised his trip to the Learning Together event. But today he insisted that he didn't make that decision alone. He said that a MAPA panel, a panel of experts responsible for public protection, had backed the decision. Ken Skelton told the jury that although there's no written record of the MAPA experts positively agreeing to the trip, they had been aware of it and had not objected. They must have said he can go, he explained. That decision would not have been made alone by me. Either way, Khan did travel by himself on a train to the capital, despite what Saskia Jones's family's lawyer said today was a remarkable number of red flags waving. Daniel Sanford, BBC News.
A woman from Mali in West Africa may have made history after giving birth to 9 babies. Doctors thought the 25-year-old was carrying 7 children and were astonished to find 2 more when they were delivered by caesarean in a hospital in Morocco. Nonuplets, as they're called, are exceptionally rare. Mali's health ministry says the mother and her 5 girls and 4 boys are all doing well. Police in Pakistan are investigating claims that a 24-year-old British woman from London, who was shot dead in Lahore earlier this week, was killed after turning down marriage proposals from 2 men. From there, our correspondent Secunda Kamani reports.
She had so much going for her. A bright, vivacious young woman. But Myra Zulfikar's life was brought to a brutal and tragic end. Today, in the eastern city of Lahore, her funeral. Her distraught father arrived from London this morning. A law graduate, Myra Zulfikar grew up in London. Around 2 months ago, she came to Pakistan with her parents to attend a family wedding. They returned to the UK, but she remained in Lahore. Myra lived in a rented house in this upmarket neighbourhood. It was here that she was attacked in the early hours of Monday morning. Police say she was shot twice. Myra's uncle told police that before she was killed, she came to him saying she was being threatened by 2 men who wanted to marry her, but whom she had turned down. Neighbours have told me that they've seen men brandishing knives pull up outside her house, and that Myra had been to the police in the past. Officials say they are yet to make any formal arrest. The murder of this young woman is resonating across both the UK and Pakistan. Her death mourned across 2 continents. Sikandar Kamani, BBC News, Lahore.
Football now, and Chelsea have made it an all-English Champions League final after beating Real Madrid 3-1 on aggregate over the 2 legs of their semi-final. They'll face Manchester City in Turkey in just over 3 weeks' time. Our sports correspondent Natalie Perks was watching.
He's been here before, just last season, in fact. But to reach the Champions League final with Chelsea, Thomas Tuchel would have to beat a European powerhouse. A cagey affair was a constant threat, though, as Chelsea defenders flailed. Mendy flew to the rescue once more. Chelsea almost made the perfect start to the second half, the confidence coursing against a spent force. But frustration was mounting as chance after chance went begging.
Well, it's the familiar foe of Manchester City who they've faced, but today UEFA insisted that this all-English affair will still be held more than 1,500 miles from here in Istanbul. It's hoped both teams will be able to take around 4,000 fans to the final in just over 3 weeks' time, but Turkey is in full lockdown right now, Sophie.
Natalie Perks, thank you. And that's it from us. Now on BBC One, it's time for the news where you are. Good night.